5 of you coming from 5 different BRICS countries. Wow, what a strong panel. Let me begin by asking you though. BRICS is a phrase. It is artificially made, man-made. And yet we see the 5 economies at very different stages now in terms of economic and political challenges. Is this a time for them to come together, or division is getting ever bigger? I want to start with Professor Lukin.
I think that there is a big mistake that some people do. Economic cooperation is not the main idea of BRICS. The BRICS that we see now is not the BRICS that was predicted by some economists before, Western economists. Because the real BRICS came not because these countries have something in common in the economy, but from originally from Russian-Chinese cooperation, then India joined this cooperation, then Brazil and South Africa. So it's more a geopolitical, I would say, project, and also it's a group which main aim is to change, or at least to alterate in their favor, the global government system. But economy, of course, they can do economic cooperation, but it's not the main idea.
Do you agree with that, Professor Nalapat from India? This is not what the BRICS is about. It should be politics. It should be geopolitics, as Professor Lukin said. Is it true?
Well, the fact is that geopolitics and geoeconomics they march together, and I would like to agree with the professor, because take for example India. Although India is very friendly with the Western countries, India has not at all agreed with the sanctions on Russia. In fact, India regards these sanctions as extremely unjustified, and it's frankly negative for the global economy. So India has not only not participated in sanctions. Just a few days ago, Prime Minister Modi spent a considerable amount of time with President Putin at St. Petersburg. So the reality situation is the 3 biggest powers of Eurasia are in BRICS. The largest economy of Africa is in BRICS, and the largest country in Latin America is in BRICS. So this is indeed a very significant forum, and I again agree with my Russian friend that we need to move beyond economics into strategy and into other matters.
Okay. Well, Professor Gelb, coming from South Africa, what about that? Is it should be geopolitics, or should be economy, or actually should be an emergence of all of this? You see already different opinions being thrown around for this discussion already.
Well, I think the original motivation for the BRICS coming together as a group beyond just the slogan that Jim O'Neill came up with, but coming together as an active group was about geopolitics, and particularly around the shifting global balance of power around the time of the financial crisis, 2007, 8, 9, when the BRICS was started. And I think the countries in the BRICS, particularly China, of course, India and Brazil, saw the opportunity to join together to promote what was then their common interest in shifting the rules of the game, so to speak, in trade governance, in financial governance globally, to take account of economic realities, which are that these are big economies.
What about now?
But even back then, when
what about now? The question is now.
Even back then, so back then, when South Africa joined in 2011, my view was that for the BRICS to sustain itself, there would have to be increasing economic and trade investment linkages between the 5 countries to sustain it as a grouping, as their sort of very specific geopolitical interests began to fall apart or diverge.
All right.
Not so much fall apart.
So we got three votes already. 1 for geopolitics, coming from Professor Lukin in Russia. 2 votes for more economic and also trade links, coming from South Africa and India. What about you? Your vote extremely important. Mr. Tang, coming from Brazil. Which side are you on?
I'm on the side that when the BRICS was formed as a political cooperation entity, there was a very valid reason for doing so. It was totally unfair that the 5 countries together, which hold a substantial amount of the population of the world and territory, really did not have a voice at all in the international financial system.
Okay, Mr. Tang, so please be direct with me, not diplomatic at all. You know, many of your friends here are sitting with us today. Which side are you on? Should it be about geopolitics or should it be about economic and further links of trade?
I think that it should be both. I think that there is a very valid reason in geopolitics for the existence and the creation of BRICS. And I think that the trade links between the countries should be increased furthermore.
Okay, your vote. Cause your solemn vote, Mr. Zhang. Which side for you?
Of course, I will choose a more comprehensive understanding on BRICS.
What does that mean, comprehensive?
Including geopolitical cooperation, meanwhile, economic cooperation. Especially, I like to say that BRICS as a G5, actually, we will, on behalf of those developing economies and transition economies, in progress of regional governance and global governance, we can have our common sense, common language.
Wow. Professor Lukin, Mr. Zhang from China already bring out the word G5. Think about that. But to you, it's more geopolitics, even though we have different votes. But for this round, let me ask you, even about the geopolitics, even about international governance, has this group so far come up with any specific plans in terms of changing the governance of international community at this point?
I don't think any contradiction. I think all 5 votes were the same. We're also talking about the same thing.
You want to be with the majority, it sounds like.
No, it's not like that. It's what I said was that BRICS is not about, mostly not about bilateral cooperation between the members, but about changing the entire economic and political system of the world, or world
Point
governance.
taken. So what about that?
So,
changing the system, governance, international.
They have achieved something. For example, first, and we can agree with our Chinese colleague about G5. In a way, it's a G5 because it's a kind of counterweight to G7 in the group of 20, in the G20. So like G7 represents the developed world, and G5 or BRICS represents the growing economies. So the first push was trying to change the existing institutions, World Bank and others.
But it has been done to a certain extent. After the crisis, the financial crisis, because everybody think about changing, even the developed economies. But what about now? This is the test, the real test.
Well, the BRICS countries met with a very strong attack from the Western world, from the people, from the countries who didn't want to change anything. So they had to come to their own, to invent their own institutions to counterbalance those.
That was the initial. What about now? That is the question I have for now. What about now? Any change of international governance that's likely to happen for the recent years?
It has been partly changed because there are more, they have more say and more votes there, but also they are trying to create their own institutions.
Professor Gelb, I saw you want to say something.
Well, I think the world is at a different place now than it was 8 or 9 years ago. And it's at a very much more unstable place with a new US president who's somewhat unpredictable, let's say, and is changing the sort of global dynamics. And so the question, I think that the challenge really that faces the BRICS now is, can they speak with a single voice?
What do you think the answer is?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult. I think that it's not clear that the interests of the different BRICS countries right now are all that well aligned.
Let's talk about
a sort of common theme.
Let's talk about some of these differences if we can. Cooperation or competition, the CEC has always been a theme accompanying the BRICS countries from the very birth of the BRICS itself. Mr. Zhang, for example, China-Russia. China has the Belt and Road Initiative. Many of the Central Asian countries also part of it. And Russia has this Eurasian Economic Corridor, and you establish the Eurasian Economic Unity in a way. And many of the countries are overlapping. So is this competition or this cooperation? Mr. Zhang.
Yeah.
Don't be diplomatic, just say it directly.
Yeah. Different economies have different problems. You know that in China, we have so a lot of manufacturing sectors. But in Russia, they mainly focusing on resources sectors. They suffering from, resources crises. So I think that the Belt and Road Initiative provide a new platform on which Russia, China, India, all of those countries can connect each other, promote infrastructure connectivities. We can promote, explore trade and investment opportunities. Let me give you a number. That is, today the trade volume between China and Russia only 70 billion US dollars. Between China and India, 60 billion US dollars. Between China and Brazil, 70 billion US dollars. So this type of level cannot catch up with trade volume between China and Vietnam.
What is that?
More than 110 billion US dollars. So that means
not even South Korea.
Of course,
China.
Between China and South Korea,
and China, United
300
States.
billion US dollars. China, US, 600 billion
Okay,
US dollars.
after that number, Professor Lukin, what do you think?
Well, the idea of BRICS is not that all their interests are the same, because it's not an international organization, it's not an alliance,
No,
it's
not
just
yet.
it's just a group. But they have some major interests which they have in common. And this interest is to change the international system of world governance, the international financial institutions, and also in a way world politics in general.
Yeah.
From that point of view, they have this, like, part of the interests are in common, and that's what brings them together. And that's enough for close cooperation, I would say.
What do you think, Professor Nalapat? China, India certainly have some issues in terms of territory and some of the latest development. But what do you think? Is that going to be competition or cooperation?
Well, the fact of the matter is that China and India have a lot more to cooperate about than they have to, for these kind of differences. The differences are far smaller in number than the elements of cooperation. Now, reality is taking the world, in my view, in a direction which is favorable to the BRICS and not very favorable to the Western countries. Take, for example, the United States. I mean, it does 3 times more trading with Asia than with Europe. So there is now a situation in which after 50 or 55 years of the Atlantic century, we are now entering into an Indo-Pacific century. And in this Indo-Pacific century, quite frankly, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, these 3 BRICS countries are very, very important. So far as Brazil is concerned, Brazil is not going to be cheated of its destiny as one of the big economies of the world. So far as Russia is concerned, I mean, it's only a matter of time before Russia resumes its status as one of the top global powers. It has all the potential, human and resources for that. So the fact is, geopolitical currents, geopolitical facts are leaning in the way of BRICS.
Yeah. At this point, I did hear a lot of words like potential, and potential from you, Professor Nalapat. That means we have to figure out a way to achieve these potential. Talking about the way to achieve the potential, the best way is to figure out what the realities are. Some members right now of the BRICS are not necessarily the economic powerhouses yet, or compared to what they used to be. The economies of Brazil, for example, of Russia shrank last year as a result of different geopolitics and also energy prices, while South Africa was also a country that's suffering from some political challenges as well. China, India, still growing at a very steady pace, and some suggest the number is quite impressive. So the question is, let me go to you, Mr. Tang from Brazil. With this very unbalanced growth rate and economic realities, are these countries still thinking similarly than they used to be, which was right after the financial crisis?
Well, I don't really think that these countries all thought similarly, except for the fact that when they were created, when BRICS was created, the debtor nations controlled the world economic system, and the creditor nations, the largest creditor nations in the world, had no say and no voice in the governance of the international monetary and financial system. And that was one of the main reasons why they were created. Now, having said that, Brazil is going through a crisis. We see it all the time. But Brazil will come out much stronger as a result of the fight against corruption. For the first time in the history of the country, the rich, the powerful, and the powerful politicians are going to jail. And just like in China, this fight against corruption will make a stronger country, will result in a stronger country. And the reasons for having the BRICS formed in the first place have changed completely. The global leadership and the global governance has been changed. The new investment bank from the BRICS, the AIIB, the RCEP in place of TPP, the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, etc. And of course the Road and Bridge Initiative, which will transform the world in such a dynamic way. So history will remember President Xi Jinping as the Chinese president who will consolidate the leadership role of China in the world. So the reasons why the BRICS were created, not all of them still exist. The world has changed.
It is evolving. It is evolving. Great point there. I want to ask you, Mr. Zhang, as a result, there is a lack of leadership in our world these days. Let's just admit about that, particularly after the US election and the recent chaos in the European economy. So will the BRICS countries as a whole be able to play this role of moral leadership? The world is in need of leadership, as we all know, if we want to move together toward one potential. Is it strong enough, big enough, and also convincing enough to the others?
I think that if you look at economic performance, actually China and India already becomes two very important driving forces for global economic growth.
That's economic growth. I'm talking about moral leadership here.
On the other hand, if you look at BRICS cooperation mechanism, that means 5 big countries, influential economies, they already work together, sitting together to discuss how to promote regional governance, global governance. In this regard, I do believe that their political influence, as well as economic influence, gradually will be expanded. And of course, it will take time for them to play real, leadership in a global society. But every country has their domestic problems and difficulties.
Okay, Professor Gelb, but very briefly from you.
Well, I think that it's wrong to sort of look at this group as a single group and expect that they're going to play that role of global leadership, whether it be morally, politically, because they are coming from very different places. There are problems in Brazil. There's problems with the way Russia is seen, rightly or wrongly, around the world. And certainly from a South African point of view, I think South Africa's moral authority, both within Africa and more broadly, has taken a very severe knock in the last 2-3 years, and I think will continue to because of domestic events. So, I think China's in a very different place, India to a considerable extent as well. China and India lesser so have the economic clout where their positions globally have to be taken very, very seriously. But the other three, I'm not so sure about at this moment.
Professor Lukin, very briefly from you, what do you think about that? As a whole, can they play a moral leadership, or actually only certain members in this specific grouping are more impressive to the rest of the world?
Frankly, we don't feel lack of leadership in Russia. Maybe we even have
I'm not talking about Russia within yourself, but rather the world, the international community. That's what we're talking about.
Anyway, as I said, I think the moral leadership or leadership in the world is not the idea of the BRICS. It have a much more modest goal to get more voice, not to undermine the current system of global governments, because it will lead to stability, but just slowly make it to evolve to represent more the interests of non-Western world, of developing world, of the growing economies. And this modest goal, I think, can be achieved.
Before we go, I do want to ask some of you a very brief question, an important one. Professor Nalapat, briefly if you can, with your philosophical ideas. The problem among the BRICS countries is that there has been a lack of understanding if we look back in history. But rather we learn about one another through third parties, for example, Western media, American or British media. Is there danger about that? How much should we know each other now? Can we do that? Professor Nalapat, briefly from you, sir.
Well, I think more than a lack of understanding, it's frankly a lack of ambition. Now, in the case of BRICS, for example, I mean, something really bold like the European Union, visa-free entry within the BRICS countries, or much greater freedom of trade between the countries. The fact of the matter is that the BRICS countries have been very careful and very, very slow and incremental in making progress. And I think it's time now in China, when the BRICS leaders meet, that they take some bigger leaps. I mean, Europe took bigger leaps, and that paid off for Europe. So I think it's time for some more ambition on the part of the BRICS countries.
Ambition to know one another, ambition to act. That's what Professor Nalapat said. The final words from you, Mr. Zhang.
I think that BRICS Summit is a very good platform and mechanism to promote mutual understanding. On the other hand, I hope that in the future, BRI also can play a role.